of migration seminars, new approaches to migration theory and research, organized by the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. And my name is Marta Kindler. And before I introduce our guest speaker, just a few technicalities. The webinar will last up to 1.5 hours, and the presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. And during the presentation, you can write down your questions or comments in the chat. And after the presentation, I will read them out loud, or you can place actually a plus so that I know that you want to ask the question in person. Now, our guest speaker today is Biao Xiang, who has been for many years a professor at the University of Oxford and is currently the director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. And Professor Xiang examines through the migration lens a wide range of political economic issues, including state-society relations, labor, social reproduction, and mobility governments. His book, Transcending Boundaries, was reprinted as a contemporary classic, and his book Self as a Method, which he co-authored with Wu Qi, was ranked as the most impactful book of 2020. So his work has been translated into a number of languages, not yet into Polish, but we hope soon. And we are very much delighted here at CMR that you have accepted our invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta. As I mentioned, Marta, just now, that I have to apologize beforehand for not being able to prepare this talk as much as I wished, because I have been rather overwhelmed by various issues, both globally and locally. I mean, it does not, I mean, none of these issues affect me personally directly, but it does make me worried, angry, and ask many questions. I suppose this is a typical condition of our world today. There's so many pressing issues of which we don't have explanations ready at our hands. So therefore that can be it's distressful, but it can be very interesting time for us intellectuals to think of new languages, new frameworks to describe at least what kind of world we are living in. As Marta mentioned, I moved from Oxford to Germany formally in last September to set up a new department in the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. And I call this department provisionally the Department of Anthropology of Economic Experimentation. We will tackle a number of themes, one number of empirical themes. I mean, the overall ideas, it's probably, I hope we'll have another chance to talk to each other about this, the main conceptual approach that we'll take. But we will tackle a number of empirical themes, and one of which is mobility and migration. So we set up called the Mobility Lab, and the idea of lab is an open space that scholars will exchange notes and observations about ongoing changes in mobilities, and more importantly, the ongoing changes in socio-economic relations as seen through the lens of mobility. And by exchanging our observations in this way, hopefully we will generate broader insights about global transformations through the lens of mobility. So I just, if it's okay, I send it to you here now, the link of the inventory, the MoLab inventory, where we exchange notes. So all of you are very welcome to contribute entries there. And we also have a Twitter handle. So today, what I wanted to talk about, educational mobility or migration from China, and what we can say about larger changes through educational mobility. So I will explain the key concept a bit later, the reversed articulation model. Let me start with the one episode or vignette which triggered me to rethink. I mean, I worked on educational mobility before, but this episode made me rethink educational mobility from China. This was something told by a relative of mine, quite a close relative. She has a daughter who was finishing her primary school and going to secondary school. And the daughter is doing quite well in the school. And actually she was doing so well that the teacher placed the daughter in a so-called priority class. Priority class are set for talented students in the school, where teachers will teach at a faster pace than the usual pace, and in order to cultivate high performance students who hopefully will do well in the citywide and eventually national examinations. And it meant to be an honor, a pride for both the students and the parents that the students can enter such a priority class. But she was determined, my relative, the mother, was determined to send the daughter overseas. And she said, it's not that I want my daughter to become anyone special, outstanding. No, the whole purpose to spend money to send the only daughter overseas. By the way, my relative was divorced, so she's a single mother. Single mother save lots of money to send the only daughter overseas. That is a huge emotional investment. The single purpose for her doing so, in my relative's words, is to save her life, to save the daughter's life. What does she mean? She means in the Chinese education system, the daughter's health now is under threat. The daughter could not go to bed before 11 every night, and it became emotionally very difficult because the mother was worried about daughter's health and urged the daughter to go to bed as soon as she can. But the daughter said, I haven't been a good student. She insisted on finishing all the homework before she could go to bed. And then every night, they ended up in quarreling or crying. And then in the morning, the mother wanted the daughter to sleep just a couple minutes more. But then the daughter wake up and complained, why you didn't wake me up earlier? I may be late for the school. Again, another round of row at home. The very first thing in the morning is this kind of arguments. So it's a physically taxing and even to the dangerous level, according to my relative. And my relative also has friends whose children's immune system decreased quite dramatically, that led to serious health implications as a result of this excessive competition and the pressure from the school. So therefore, she said, going overseas is to save life. This, of course, reminded me of the scenario that when I was thinking going overseas for my education 25 years ago, when I finished my master's already. I'm not a primary school student. I finished my master's. I went overseas the first time at the age of 26 for my PhD, completely adult student. And at that time, there was a bit of debate within the family. I mean, I have the full scholarship and etc., so the money is not the issue. And my parents, as well as some of my friends, were worried that, oh, if you go overseas, maybe you are too thin and too weak. You're physically too weak for study overseas because the food will be horrible in England, and everyone knew that there's no much fun to do a PhD in a Anglo-Saxon universities, right? You have to read so much every week and etc. So if you stayed in China, at least you will have less worry about the health. So you see the situation is almost 180 degrees reverse. I mean, in my time, go overseas is to work hard, and people worried that I was physically not fit enough. But 20 years later, for my relative, of course, students have become much younger, and the education became very expensive project for the middle class. And the most important difference as compared to my time is that now going overseas is to save life. Staying in China is regarded as something very damaging for your health. This is really new to me. And if you look at the history of student migration from China, from the end of 1970s, I have documented it somewhere else. And this notion of going overseas, not for any apparently utilitarian concerns, not for getting better job, have a higher pay, higher income, nor is it for learning more advanced technologies and to contribute to the motherland. But now it is for save life and to pursue a genuine human happiness and to protect your human nature. This is if you go to the social media and talk, if you listen to how parents are talking about overseas education, you have the human nature is a very important discourse. So that is make me rethink the meaning of educational mobility. And then why reversed articulation model? Because this type of migration is almost the exact opposite to what a group of French Marxist anthropologists represented by Claude Masur in the 1960s, 1970s, what they said about labor migration from Africa, particularly West Africa to West Europe. They proposed the articulation model, which is one of the most important Marxist debates in anthropology in the 20th century, in my view. And the articulation model is to say that, okay, how are you going to explain labor migration from Africa to Europe? Why don't the people migrate from Europe to Africa as labor? The seemingly, the deceptively simple question, but a quite profound one. For me, that is a quite important way of theorize migration. It's not just to look at, people move because they have aspirations, they want to have a higher income, and etc. But they ask the question, what is the historical and the structural condition that give rise to this particular pattern of migration? Can this just be explained by individual motivations, explained by wage differentiations? Of course, they can on the superficial level, but that's not enough. And they said that the people migrating from Africa to Europe should be understood as a process of value transfer. It's not just a movement of people. When people move from Africa to Europe, they're bringing a large amount of value with them. what is this value? The question is like, I mean, the explanation is like this. I mean, why didn't the factory hire workers in France, and why do they need to hire people from Algeria and Mali? It's because they're cheaper. Okay, why this labor are cheaper? And then you look at how this labor become labor, the process, how a child grow up into an adult man. I mean, most of the labor migration from Afro-Europe were male, become a man, and it's an able-bodied man over at 18, 20, or 25 years' time. That 20, 25 years' time requires a tremendous amount of social investment. You need a tremendous amount of labor of care, attention, and nutrition, food, housing, in order to turn a child into an able-bodied man. This process, of course, takes place in France and West Europe, but in a market model, it's monetarized, right? It is you have to buy commodities in order to raise children. And then the whole process is very expensive in a visible way, which you can calculate on monetary terms. But in Africa, this happens in a pre-capitalist, non-market economy. You have a huge number of women who will work free in the household, the mothers, the sisters, and even married the wives. And then peasants, subsistence economy, so you get the grain basically free. Free in terms of in the monetary calculation. But of course, it's not free in terms of the human labor inputs. I mean, the food cannot drop from the sky. It must be cultivated, sorted, preserved, prepared, served by human. And all this human labor actually is turned into the muscles, the bones, energy of the body, right? But then it's not, but this process is not mediated by money. So therefore, but then it appears to be very cheap, right, in the monetary terms. So when they migrate, they are carrying with them this whole set of value accumulated over years, resulted from such a particular mode of human production, or we can call it social reproduction, meaning how birth, how people give birth, how people raise children, and how food is provided and shelter is provided, how the ill and injured are cared for. Right? So it is a result of that particular domain or pattern of social reproduction, and this migrant man embody extra value contributed by the community and particularly by women. Of course, the articulation model is more sophisticated than that, and also talk about the tribal society, the structure, the patriarchy, and how that actually, the tension between, of course, men and the women, but also tension between older men and the younger men, and how the younger man's migration also perpetuate the tribal structure. So articulation model also suggests that the patriarchs, the head of household, the head of lineage, or head of tribes actually form a certain complicit collaboration with the capitalist sectors in the metropolitan, because they both exploit the young males' labor force and exploit the females' reproductive sexual labor, either directly or indirectly, either through economic means or through social and ideological means. But so the idea of articulation is to say that you have people being produced or reproduced in the pre-capitalist society, and through migration, this pre-capitalist mode of social reproduction is articulated, is linked with the capitalist mode of material industrial production. And then the articulation model is basically a pattern of value transfer, a pattern through which transnational social inequality is being reinforced. So what we see today is what I call the reversed articulation model. You see exactly opposite, because the social reproduction now is being moved overseas, right? The education migration is one example, but also we see the dramatic increase in terms of proportion, in terms of speed, of investment migration. And I don't know about the latest policy change in Poland, but there was a kind of talked about in China as well as a possible destination of investment migration. I haven't got a chance to look into the policies there, but we know like Portugal, Malta, and the UK, so the policy changed. Officially, the scheme does not exist anymore. And of course, the US remains the most a desirable destination, and Canada at the early stage was very desirable, and now stopped. But just last week, again, it was. I didn't check the Canadian side, but according to the Chinese social media report, there's a huge surge in the social media search in China about migrating to Canada as highly skilled or as investors. We can discuss that later. Within 1 week, in end of March and early April, it increased, I think, 28 times the social media, online social media search just for the keywords of migration to Canada, as a response to the widespread disappointment, disillusionment in China now about lockdown measures. So the investment migration is similar to educational migration in the sense that the reproduction is being moved overseas. What do I mean by that? If you look at education, of course, kids go overseas to study, receiving education overseas, then grow up there and being taken care of there. Where the money is from? Money is coming from China, and the parents are working in China. So parents stay in China as where they can generate wealth, but they support social reproduction in the destination. And over investment migration is even more straightforward example of this trend. We know that very few investment migrants really make any serious productive investment. Most of them buy properties, and very often they basically deposit certain amount of fund in designated bank as the destination country government required. And why do they want to move to overseas? For the investors who actually benefited the most from China's economic growth, mainly for reproduction. So you have this typical pattern, which Iwan Ong documented in the end of 1990s about Hong Kong, but now it's happened on a larger scale across China, is that the husband will stay in China making money, and the wife and the children go to Canada, US, Singapore, or now increasingly Europe, like Poland, Hungary, and of course Malta, and the UK is still very popular, to go these countries to receive education, for having better quality air have more greenery, and the husband is hoping that they will join them after he retires. So it's the production, material production taking place in the original countries, but the reproduction is taking place overseas. And this actually is also the case for many high-skilled labor migrants. I mean, I interviewed some people here in Germany, and they are IT specialists, medical specialists, or startup entrepreneurs. I mean, Germany are quite generous in welcoming people like that. And the reason when I talk to them, actually, they did experience downward mobility by moving to Germany in terms of financial incomes as well as a career progression. But they come for, many people say that for family, meaning that they will have more time for family, a slower pace of life, more relaxed living condition in general, just to be more human. So again, is pursuing the human nature is for the sake of reproduction or for the sake of life itself, rather than for economic benefits. So the migration is kind of reversed articulation. And so this is a straightforward geographical reversal of the articulation model. But if we look at the institutional setup, we can see another reversal. In the 1960s, 1970s, the classical articulation model, as we see, is articulation between a pre-capitalist tribal mode of social reproduction with a capitalist mode of material production. But today, in China, as well as in like South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and to some extent Singapore too, social reproduction is completely commodified. Actually, is commodified to a greater extent than in many destination countries in the West, especially for the middle class, because I mean, there's still free state education. There's still free, not free, but there's still the low level of medical care for low-income populations in China, for instance. But if middle class, you're above a certain level, then, I mean, you want to compete with others, then everything is commodified. You have to use your private money to buy all kinds of services in the market to meet the basic need of a family, buying houses and go have proper treatment in hospital, and of course go to school, etc. So that's completely commodified. In comparison, it's like at least in Germany, you still have better social welfare. I mean, that's the interesting point. They're not necessarily coming to enjoy social welfare, but they say that since there is social welfare here in Europe, so the general social environment is more relaxed. People are less worried. So you don't have this kind of rat race that drives everyone crazy in China. So that is that kind of societal effects of social welfare and security is what they are after, rather than the social benefit in itself. So that is another sense of reversal. But here, of course, I want to emphasize this reversal is not as straightforward or as stark as the first geographical reversal. One important reason that educational migration and the investment migration, and to some extent, highly skilled migration, are welcomed by the destination countries precisely because these destination countries are also going through commodification of social welfare and the reproduction to a great extent. So the reason that the US is still most desirable choice certainly is not because the US has provided any good public services, but they have lots of bubbles that is a wealthy population, regardless of your cultural background, can relatively easy buy into. People like the rich, the family like the US because it's quite a transactional. As long as they have money, everything can be settled to some extent. So the withdrawal of state intervention in social reproduction across the world is an important reason to give rise to reproduction migration. So this is what I call the reproduction migration. So it's the migration for the purpose of maintaining and enhancing life, including education, care, and also the food, like concerns such as food security, good environment, etc. So that's the main picture I wanted to provide. So what is the implications of such a reversal articulation model? A couple of points. Number one is that we have to investigate how the political economy of value transfer intersects with a certain ideological articulation. So the articulation here has another meaning. We know the articulation in the 1970s, used by this French anthropologist in primarily a political economy usage, but in Gramsci and oh my God, I can't immediately, the Portuguese sociologist talk about the socialism and hegemony, have used the articulation in a different sense, meaning that you bring different ideas together, then create a sense of hegemony, meaning a good common sense or strong. Good not as good as we judge it, but is that judged by the people in the sense that they feel that the common sense explains their life. It makes sense. It's persuasive. So therefore, it becomes hegemony. So articulation, the ideational articulation is important. Why is that? Because when you move social reproduction overseas from your own home country, you need a whole set of new ideas to rationalize this, to explain your decisions to yourself as well as to others. And especially, you have to articulate why that is valuable, why is that desirable. Right? So this is not an automatic process. You need lots of labor, not only by migrants themselves, but of course we know by lots of other commercial actors, such as recruitment agencies for universities and migration agencies, which facilitate investment migration flows, which obviously become a very important business, especially, I think, in the coming months. Let's see, after the COVID, and which may indicate a certain level of, I'm not sure we can say political uncertainty, but certainly there's a sense of anxiety in China now among the middle class. So this is the political economy articulation needed to be examined at the same time as the ideational articulation, the whole process of meaning making. So this, I think, is more complex. The ideational articulation in the current reversed articulation model is more complex than that in the classical articulation model. Of course, in the tribal society, they also sense of honor, relations, emotion, sentiment too. But now it is a global stage, at a global scale, there's the circulation of certain languages, images, discourses are very important. This is number one. Number two, I think is we probably need to rethink the thesis of the end of 20th century, which is the rise of Asia, rise of East, and particularly rise of China. Certainly, China has become a major economic power in the traditional sense, in the conventional sense. If you measure economy by looking at how much material goods they have produced, and particularly by measuring how much energy has been consumed. But if you really look at the question of added value, especially if you look at not only material value, but also values, these moral values or the ideological values, that can be important for economy, because only a place that is able to provide values, that the people will go there, people will consume, people will live their life there, which will inevitably create economic value, especially in the post-industrial society, in which technology and all kinds of human needs beyond the subsistence level become more and more important in driving and shaping economy. So this kind of these ethical values actually is important, it become closely associated with economic value. So if you measure economy or economic life in this way, I'm afraid that probably is far too early to say that the world economic or value gravity has shifted to the East. At least China has not sorted out the fundamental question, which is about the human reproduction. They have created a very impressive model of producing shoes, clothes, cars, and producing rather high-tech devices, and also producing particular type of social institutions which are very difficult to replicate in other parts of the world. But they have not yet figured out how they reproduce human being in a way that is sustainable, in a way that most people will feel content with. If you haven't sorted that out, I'm afraid this model of development is not complete. And in the 21st century, this part, the reproduction part, will become possibly more important than the part of material production as a part of holistic development model. So this second point, probably we need to rethink the much celebrated so-called from the West to the East shift. Finally, I think it's important for us to rethink the whole question about global economy, whether or not we're moving towards a global economy where the human reproduction will become more and more important source of profit, become a more and more important source of even power. So who the educational model is more desirable, where the lifestyle broadly defined, where the lifestyle is more desirable, may make the place just more powerful in having says in the international relations or in developing a market, developing other sectors of economy. On this front, I must say I do not have very clear, strong evidence to say this shift has happened already. But if you look at the development strategies of some places, such as Singapore, you would see this trend. So, Martha, I will stop here. So I really look forward to your questions. As you see, it is a very early stage, and it is I mean, this could be completely wrong, but I thought, oh, it is still worth exploring because it can be falsified. It may be wrong, but it can be clearly disproved to be wrong. And maybe in doing this, there will be some, I can learn something. So for this purpose, I especially welcome and appreciate your critiques. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I open right now the Q&A session, so I very much encourage you to either write in the chat your comments and questions, and I can read them out. And here we have a first question and comment coming already. A very informative presentation. Thank you. Would you say that social reproduction is a cross-class concern, or is this limited to the emerging middle class? Also, is there a rural or urban dimension to these concerns, or is it limited predominantly to urban settings?
Thank you very much. First of all, the pressure of social reproduction in education and healthcare, and also the general feeling that to protect the human nature, have a genuine, happy childhood and a better environment, that of course, so far the primarily a middle class concern. And this is partly because the middle class have a choice to pursue a different way of organizing their social reproduction. And for the working class, for the rural population, they of course have same concerns. I mean, education, the anxiety about education is definitely evident across classes. But since they don't have much options, so they don't think, or at least they don't talk too much about it. So now, then we can say that it's the common concerns, the common worries, I mean, the social reproduction across classes, but the different manifestations, which in turn leads to different strategies and actions. So what I described as the out-migration, the reversed articulation model primarily applies to the middle class and higher class. But for the rural working class, this is also having an effect on them. Two effects. Number one is that more and more working class are also pursuing educational migration in two ways. Number one is international migration. I mean, you will find lots of foreign students from China in overseas actually come from relatively low income families, but families save all the money sent overseas. So there is a generalization of educational mobility, international. And the second is internal educational mobility. This actually is a massive phenomenon. Rural population move to cities, not to work, but very often for the children's education. The typical model would be the fathers go very far away, like a big city, the Beijing or Shanghai, to work as construction workers or restaurant workers, and send the remittances back in the rural village in the northwest, for instance. And then the family try to buy an apartment in their county seat, close to the village, in order for the child to go to the primary school in the county seat, because the education level there is better. And then for many families in the county seat, they will do something similar in order to move to the slightly bigger cities next to their home place for education purpose. And as a clear result of that is so-called the emptying out of rural schools and even county schools in China. At the same time, there is overcrowded students' bodies in schools in larger cities. That is a very clear trend. So that is educational migration as a result of reproduction pressure for the working class. So then another result or coping strategy of the working class is labor migration. I have written about this somewhere else to compare labor migration after 1990s, especially after 2000s, as to the more classical labor migration. I mean, they appear to same if you just look at the migration pattern. But now the driving force for labor out-migration from China is more and more about the pressure of reproduction. If you want to get married, even you want to marry a village girl for the man, you have to have an apartment in the city. Just building a new house in the village is not good enough. Nobody will marry you. And the cost of marriage is very high. And the future education for children and the medical care concern, all this add up that force many people to migrate in order to save money quickly. I mean, there's lots of nuances because they're not necessarily receiving higher wages by going overseas. But by going overseas, they will save money quickly at the moment when they need the money for their reproduction purposes, such as getting married and etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paweł Kaczmarczyk has raised his hand, please.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you very much for this very interesting and eyes-opening speech. I have one question, in fact, because when I was just listening to your talk, and particularly to the first part of it, it had reminded me of the approach that has been discussed in United Nations Development Program report, the Human Development Report from 2009. And in this report, they used the concept of human capability approach, and where migration has been presented as a process enhancing the substantive set of freedoms people can enjoy. And my question would be, what do you think, is there any link or bridge between the concept you are working on right now and the human capabilities approach?
I mean, there is, of course, connections because human is a capability, right? It's a human capability. Yeah. Human capability is a very broad concept, but conceptually, I wanted to emphasize actually it's a very different approach, so very different ideas. Number one, human capability is kind of the emphasis is on individual. The human capability is the individual's capability of doing things as he or she desires in a very practical way, not only theoretically, but they can actually take the bus, go somewhere and sell vegetable or cast the vote, so they can exercise the right in a practical way. So of course, there must be individual. And then it is the sense of migration will therefore increase capability and therefore will empower and enable individuals. But what I emphasize, you have the reproduction moved from home place to other places is primarily I would say that actually it's quite passive. I want to emphasize the structural condition. And in this part, I mean, in this sense, I'm directly influenced by the 1960s, 70s articulation and dependency discussion to look at the migration actually as a response to structural condition. Of course, the response is taken by real people with agencies, but fundamentally it is reinforcing the structure. And personally, I must say, I feel it is quite a negative development when the reproduction is moved from the local place and is always, as I said, just last minute, you have this kind of constant internal educational migration. Basically means the bankruptcy of the countryside, the rural community, especially cultural bankruptcy. As we know, village schools are very important for village communities. Village communities already has experienced kind of poverty in culture. And the village school teachers are often the key person. I mean, for thousands of years, village teachers are the person who settles disputes and create a certain harmony. And as a soul of community, I mean, if they are gone, what is left? Of course, many commentators in China have noticed this already. So this, the migration of reproduction, the function of reproduction from society is a sad thing, so that is, again, go back to my earlier question. Now we do see the centralization of globalization of desires, of what is regarded as a desirable lifestyle, what is regarded as useful knowledge. I mean, it's become more and more homogeneous. I mean, local society have no say, and everyone wanted to have their life being reproduced and produced in the desirable centers. That is not sustainable, and we have to find a way to fight against it. So in my view, the human capability will be increased by not migrating, by building a more robust community as where they are. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask now Xiao Jin to read out yes, her question. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting talk, Professor Xiang. I am a current PhD candidate at Heidelberg University in Germany, and my dissertation also deals with Korean ethnic minority in China and their international migration flows, and see what's the position in the huge Chinese migration flow. And then as a Chinese citizen and a PhD candidate who dealing with migration studies, I actually feel a lot of resonance with your talk. I have two questions for you. Firstly, in terms of the educational migration and the investment migration that you talked about, we could also observe similar patterns from South Korea or other cases that you also mentioned, which has been articulated as astronauts family. So what do you think of the speciality of Chinese migration trend, and what are the differences of Chinese case from other countries' case? This is the first question. And my second question is sort of related to the last question raised by Pavik. From the perspectives of capacity and aspirations framework, I do agree that increasing numbers of Chinese population have the aspirations of moving out. However, the number of Chinese people who have the capacity to invest for their next generation's education and their family's safety and also protect their property still remains extremely small. The number is really small. And we also could observe some evidences that China is gradually closing its door by preventing people from going out by issuing less passports and visas recently, so that the capacity and the conditions of people's mobility or international mobility are more and more restricted. So I wonder how you interpreted this trend or the future pattern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is, I mean, some comparison between China and South Korea and other countries would be very meaningful. And I think Hong Kong probably is the first country, the earliest example of this reversed articulation model, and certainly South Korea is very likely to be the second one. So therefore, it is quite a common phenomenon across at least East Asia. The specificities of China is, for me so far, is actually not particularly salient if you just look at the individual's migration behavior or their motivations or even discourses. I mean, people also talk about, I'm not sure about the South Korea, I haven't read much, but if you read literature about Taiwan and Hong Kong, they also talk about human nature and happy childhood and have a good foundation for the children. Foundation meaning the children physically healthy and happy, psychologically strong, have all this kind of very humanistic discourse to justify their migration pattern. And the specificity of China comes from bigger picture. If we look at the history of the migration from China, and especially the history of China's relation to the world, that is quite different as compared to the relation of South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan to the world. And we know there is the Cold War period, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and Singapore and Malaysia. All these countries actually experience similar migration pattern to the West is precisely because China was excluded from the West-led global system. So there is there's a complex relation between the integration of smaller Asian countries into the West and the China's isolation during the Cold War. And then, so how to interpret now China also experienced something similar as we observe in these smaller Asian countries, South Korea, Hong Kong, etc. Is simply China join a general pattern, or actually the fact that China is joining a global pattern actually means something very a deep shift in the global order. So I'm sorry I cannot fully develop this thesis here, but again, this go back to what I said at the very beginning, how we understand the migration. If you just look at the migration as a behavior, we'll very quickly get confused because at the end of the day, you will say everyone migrate for very similar purposes. But if we look at the history, look at the meaning of migration in terms of how migration is related to global historical changes, then probably we will raise more questions. Sorry, so my question on that, my answer, I know it's just a very tentative suggestion, and it's far from satisfactory. Second question, future trend. Again, this is a very contingent factor, China's tightening up of outer migration again. So we don't know. And honestly, I don't know in terms of number. Clearly, from 2020, that has been decreased as the actual number of passports being issued, decreased dramatically. But the two things can be said, nevertheless. Number one, the desire of outer migration remain high and actually increased quite dramatically over the last 2 years, and especially last 1 year. And again, especially over last 1 month, partly because of the fear that China will close itself again. So people wanted to rush out as a last bus to the world. Number two, even before the new restriction over outer migration, I agree, of course, I mean, the absolute number, I mean, the proportion of the migrants to the total population in China is very small. Though the absolute number is not so small, if you look at the students from China, and of course it's clearly the world's largest source country of international students. So the number is small, but we also have to look at the effect on the education system in China in general. Because once you go, this kind of educational mobility is regarded as the most desirable way to pursue your education and social reproduction. So the whole ethos, the whole purpose, and the institutional setup of education will be different. We can look at all these international, so-called international classes, right? In many state high schools, which did not exist before, but now become very popular measure for high schools and the international schools, and as well as all kinds of the tuition industries, etc. But of course, they are now the tuition industry has been cracked down quite badly. I must say it's more effective than I expected. So it is all, again, just I think today or yesterday, possibly there is either yesterday or today, the Ministry of Education issued a major change about the education system again regarding the transition from secondary school to senior high school. So a lot of things now are in flux. But I want to say that the analysis of this student migration and the reversed articulation model is an analytical exercise, meaning that we cannot say just the sheer number of migration is so large that it will affect China or the world. No, the sheer number is not large enough to be any decisive force, but it has a ripple effect. It sets certain models, it instills certain type of ideals, and also more importantly, it does reflect or indicate what the people are thinking, how people feel. Yeah. So in this sense, therefore, migration is a lens to understand larger global changes. And this goes back to our motto of the MoLab project. It's not about migration itself, but take migration as a lens to look at other things. Otherwise, migration is always a minority. The officially defined migrants are a very small minority of the world population. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will read out the next question, which actually you partly already responded to. I have this feeling, how did the pandemic and now to a degree also the war impact the established system, which helped to prop up the pattern of reproduction you discussed? A phenomenon like educational migration relied on a well-oiled system, which helped it to function. How does the sense of crisis change this kind of model?
Yeah, the great question, Christoph. I suppose the sense of crisis, I guess you're thinking of the sense of crisis among the population, not as a government. I mean, government also not have a sense of crisis. The crisis, of course, tended to propel people to leave. So this is difficult. I'm sorry, I cannot give you clear prediction. But again, if you take migration and all the desire as an indicator to bigger questions about the pattern of world development, I think it's interesting to see where people feel safe. And still people, there's a war in Europe, but if you ask the Chinese people, where do you want to go? Probably Europe now become number one. If the wishful choice is, practically now they're thinking Singapore, Australia, Canada, and etc. But because of language and etc. So there is, for me, that is an interesting question. Europe is still highly regarded as a place that will provide kind of safety. You feel settled, even not legally settled, but you feel kind of mentally settled, and you feel you can pursue a certain meaning of life. But this is what actually many people complain about in China. Like somehow life becomes just so busy, so pressurized that it becomes meaningless. So this, I think, again, empirically, it's very difficult to predict what will happen. Probably doesn't matter too much because migration, as I said, is a very small part of world development. But nevertheless, it tells us what is regarded as a desirable lifestyle, what is regarded as good social arrangement. We probably can discern something like that through change of migration choices.
A quick follow-up,
yes.
Because like you mentioned in your presentation, it used to be a fairly transactional thing. So people, it was very straightforward. If you had the money, you could go abroad under the way the system has worked. So say you invested into a treasury bonds or an apartment in Budapest, and then you had access to this safe haven, right? So it had a very clear and very straightforward appeal moving abroad. And do you think that in any sense is changing or began to be looked at differently? Because flexible citizenship relied on something similar. You made your move and you gained sense of security, which now is sort of gone, right? Or not as simple.
Oh, I think that part, of course, I'm not familiar with a specific case, how they purchase properties in Europe, but I bet that part wouldn't change fundamentally. So the articulation model, the ideational articulation is important, but the ideational articulation must be materialized. So you need money, and you need to calculate how you can generate sustained incomes, even though you don't work in Europe, right? And how do you protect your asset? The notion of asset now become very important because many people, after migrating, they are no longer economically productive, or much less so than they were in China. So how do they get the money? Very often through asset. They have asset in Beijing and 2 apartments and rent out that generates enough rent for them to have a comfortable life in some part of Europe and etc. So that asset management, transnational management of asset, all this I bet will be very important. And this is another part of articulation. You articulate the wealth different modes of wealth generation in different parts of the world to sustain a particular type of transnational life. That material processes are absolutely crucial. I must say that I personally have not seen much research, detailed research about that, how middle class or upper middle class family manage their globally dispersed assets in order to maintain or to support their transnational mode of social reproduction. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Łukasz Kmiotek wanted to ask a question, yes?
Hello again. So I'd like to go back to the European context, and I have one question regarding, so first of all, thank you for your insightful presentation that goes back to the beginning of the origins of the migrations, that conceptualize it as a labor migration. So what I liked the most was your, if I understood correctly, was your conceptualization of migration as a pattern of value transfer from one society into another. And my question relates to the concept which is intrinsically linked to the migration process, which is transnationalism. So these are the links that migrants in the host country has with the diaspora has with their families in the countries of origins. So as you probably know, at the moment when Poland entered the EU and Schengen zone, there was a huge migration flow from Poland to UK, namely from UK. As you were living there, probably you had to meet a lot of Poles on the streets. And so we have observed in the first period, 2005, 6, 7, important flow of the remittance, into Poland. Okay, but gradually this flow has diminished, has disappeared, evaporated. So my question is whether your theory has a predictive power of can it predict the process of this transnationalism of the link with the immigrants in the country of the settlement with the country with the family in at the country of origin. So that would be that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And I have to be brutally honest. No, I mean, this theory has no predictive power. It does not seek predictive power. Then you may ask, what is the value of a theory that is so bluntly renounce its predictive capacity? It's for me, I mean, this is a big question. I mean, what is the purpose of theory? For me, theory is not to predict reality, because we are all part of reality, and everyone can change reality in a small ways. But the most important function of theory is to understand the reality in a deeper way. So the whole value is to actually just to describe picture in a more precise way. And why it can't predict? Because when we want to predict situation like a migration, then you have to isolate migration into, or reduce the migration into a number of measurable variables. And you will have to rely on lots of assumptions. And this is what that's what my explanation certainly cannot do that, because the whole point is to say that rapid economic development actually lead to quite a high level of anxiety in the reproduction domain. And then that surprisingly will lead to the kind of redivision of labor in the world, meaning production move to China and East, and the reproduction, the center of human reproduction, kind of move to West to some extent. So it is about to capture the surprise. Yeah. Here, I mean, since we're now in a migration study center, I'm also wondering what is the purpose of production of like migration, or whether or not the migration will continue or not continue. It may be interesting for border control agencies, but somehow I don't feel it does tell us too much about critical issues in our life, which means the issues that we should worry about, citizens should discuss and debate about. Yeah. So So that's I know, again, my answer is far from satisfactory, but it's a wonderful question that we need to rethink the productive capacity of theory, which is regarded as a very important quality of theory, and of course in natural science, but in humanities and social sciences, yeah, I have some doubt, reservation about that.
Thank you very much. There is a question from Eleanor Gong. Many thanks for this amazing thought-provoking speech. A very quick question. We notice a huge surge in the backflow of Chinese talents who've been actually among them moved overseas for education. How do you think of its impact on the reverse articulation model? Is this kind of flowing back another way of reproductive migration as returnees want to take advantage of their global experience to climb social ladder in China?
That is really a good question. What you said here is, I think, very accurate. People go. So the desirable, the ideal situation for many middle-class parents are like that. You go overseas, and so therefore you can skip all this excessive competition in the Chinese education system. But you go overseas, you do well, and then you become, for example, a representative of a large transnational companies and come back to China, and then you will be just stay outside and stay above all this competition in the job market, right? Then you still enjoy all the food, and you can have friendship there, and you still have a good life, and you can be away from all this pressure. But this is the parents, the wishful thinking of lots of young people. As far as I know, many young people actually still prefer staying overseas. There's change a bit. I think after 2008, the return flow increased quite dramatically. But from, I think, over the last 2 years and from now on, I think, at least in terms of people's desire and motivation, I think the return probably wouldn't be a first choice. But of course, we must acknowledge the fact that the economy in many destination countries is not doing well. So there's not opportunities overseas either. So that's, and then also we need to look at the long-term life trajectory of the return migrants. Many people go back to China because the income is higher in China and more opportunities, or at least more business opportunities. So from productive consideration, which they have to consider at the age of 35 or 30, so they go back to China first. But then whether or not when the reproduction become a major concern in their life. For instance, when they have their children, and whether or not the returnees would be eager to send their children overseas again when these returnees reach retirement age, or would they consider moving overseas? Again, we know it is a very small number, but just as an indication of the distribution of desire, let's say, it could tell us something. So it's a very good question. It shows that the reversed articulation model is not a one-way street. You just it's just go. Because production and reproduction, material production and human reproduction are always combined. This cannot be, it's not separated as two things. Every human being have to do the two things at the same time. So there will be a kind of, it will manifest itself as a kind of circular migration. So yeah, thank you again. And I have not fully theorized very clearly the role of return, after graduation return, in my model. Yeah, I will think more.
We have two final questions in the chat. The first one starts with a comment as well. Some young people from Jingyu Li, some young people in cities are having a romanticized imagination about the rural life. They feel tired of the fast-paced life and the high pressure, even if some of them are elites in the middle class in cities. Different from what you mentioned, the bankrupt of the rural, these young people try to manage farms or run hotels in tourist sites, even if it may last for only several years. It seems that this group of people have a similar purpose sorry, I have to shift this.
So those go over abroad. Yeah, I can read it, but I can see.
I'm just reading it out because later on in the recording, people won't be able to read it out. So basically, it seems that this group have a similar purpose of those who go abroad. They want to escape and have a relaxed life. Do you think they are similar because they both are reflecting a certain social transformation? What should be the difference between these two groups except for the pushing force?
Oh, I agree. You know, if we look at, as I said, migration is not just a behavior, but look at the migration as a part of social transformations, and these two types of migration from city to overseas and from city to countryside, middle class, are a result of the same social concerns. And we know that there's actually quite a high end of population doing that, moving to especially Yunnan, Guangxi provinces in southwest China. And then you have quite elite private school, all these kind of experimental Montessori schools in these places, catering to the needs of the educational needs of these families. Then I ask them, oh, you know, you do this very progressive way of education, the primary and the kindergarten level. And I said, okay, what are you going to do when you reach to secondary school and even higher school? Then you have college, right? You have to integrate yourself into the mainstream education system. So far, all the answer I have received from the people who are doing that, moving to the countryside, are that, of course, the kids will have to go overseas. I mean, if they received Montessori and forest, open field, open farm, schooling education, I mean, no way they can participate in the mainstream public school system in China. So therefore, they are connected in this way. And also the two groups are similar in terms of the strategy, in terms of how they finance the whole pattern of mobility. Most of families who moved to the countryside, of course, maintain the jobs or business in the cities. Cities are still the place where they generate income. But you mentioned some young people now became kind of new type of farmers or set up the hotels in the countryside. That is slightly different. That is kind of young people wanted to try out. So it's I think that will be a fringe type of what I call the reproduction migration. Very difficult to say that they are pursuing social reproduction in the countryside by setting up hotels, by having a new business in the countryside.
Yeah. And the final question from Marta Jaroszewicz, a very inspiring lecture. I was wondering whether and if yes, how reverse articulation model takes into consideration political structure and processes of political diffusion. I mean, whether social reproduction you mentioned also contains a political component.
Yeah, many thanks. I need another whether and if how reverse articulation model consider political structure and the process of political diffusion or the politics of articulation, I mean, that is very political, not in the conventional sense. I mean, these migrants, they don't shout the slogans in the airport, and they wouldn't apply for refugee status. But they are political in the sense that they go overseas not just to earn more money or just to move away from poverty. They go overseas because they have certain concerns about values. What is a decent, meaningful, and good life? Of course, the economy is a very important part of it. They're still middle class, they want the comfort, they want the convenience, they want the security, etc. But on top of that, what is new about this pattern of migration? It has lots to do with the question of meaning. So therefore, the discourse about human nature becomes so important, or saving life becomes so important in parents' discussion about the children's educational mobility. So that is political, even though it is in a very implicit form. So finally, I think it's a wonderful question that reminds us of another important reversal in migration. I remember in 2003, I wrote an article called Emigration from China is kind of very superficial overview. In that article, I say, what changed in terms of outer migration from China since 1949. I said that a major change after 1980s was a depoliticization of migration, because migration is no longer regarded as a political or ideological matter. It is regarded as an individual choice, and is regarded as an issue related to economic development. In the year of 1986, ordinary citizens can apply for private passports. Before that, passport is regarded as a political issue. The border, national border, is not only national border is also dividing line of ideology and the politics. But now it seems surprising to so many people in the world, including myself, there is such a reversal of the depoliticization of migration. More and more middle class now are considering migration as a way to express their political opinions, as a way to choose a desirable life, broadly construed, which definitely include a political consideration. And at the same time, the state is also regulating migration more and more as a political act. So this is why the number of passports being issued was reduced so dramatically. So the first half year of 2021, during the first 6 months of 2021, the Chinese government issued only 2% of the passport that were issued in the first 6 months of 2019. So 98% of drop. So, I mean, this could not be, it's a passport, not a visa. It's a passport. So it's not it's purely the decision taken by the Chinese government. Obviously, there is political consideration or anxiety behind such dramatic change. I mean, we don't know if it is a one-time change or what happened in the coming years, but there is another reversal, not directly related to the reversal of articulation model, but it's a reversal of the general paradigm with which migration is defined and understood, both by people and by government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk and great discussion. And I would like also to thank all our participants today. And I would like to also encourage you to follow our webinar series with other talks as well. And thank you again, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, if you have a chance, do please take a to take a look at our mobility lab
We
invention.
certainly will. For sure.
There are a
Thank you
couple
very
of pieces, yeah, related to this theme as well. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.